right, I want to go ahead and call the Transportation and Public Safety Budget Committee meeting to order. First on the agenda, are there any bill introductions? Seeing none. One of the things I'd like to check with you guys, we currently have the Department of Transportation budget hearing first and then budget recommendations. Is there any objections to go ahead and doing the State Fire Marshal budget recommendations first so that he doesn't have to wait for 2 or 3 proposals? Okay. All right. So with that, everybody should have some additional information regarding the pay plan that was initiated by the State Fire Marshal. I think it's everybody's aware. It was, you may not be aware, I kind of forget where information pops in sometimes, but the governor implemented that. It was supposed to be a 2023 salary enhancement, but the governor implemented it on January 9th of 2022. So it's in effect for this fiscal year. And it's basically a 3-step increase for all of the employees, but 3, I believe. Go ahead, Doug.
It depends on the position. Some were less or more than others. The ranges for everyone except the 3 employees range from a 2% increase up to as high as a 17% increase, depending on what the wage survey data came back that D of A did. So like the investigators, those were 3 ranges. They went from 28 to 31, and they went straight. But there were others that maybe only got 1 step, so they maybe only got 2.5%. And that, again, was based on the survey and that they did both in-state and out-of-state with surrounding states.
So anyway, 2 to 17%.
Yes.
And 3 steps, if I'm correct, a step is, or excuse me, 3 pay grades. Is a pay grade 2.5% or is it 5%?
5. The grades, when you go from like 28, 29, 30, those are 5%.
So, so they went 29, 30, 31, the investigators, so they went up 15%.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. With that, let's go ahead and start with discussion of the fiscal year 2022 budget. There was not a $100,000 equipment grant for 2022, correct?
Yes, correct.
One of the things that I'd like to put in the 2022 is similar to what we did with the emergency medical services. I'm not quite confident exactly that I know what the numbers are going to be, but that we support the application for Spark funds to fund equipment for small rural fire departments. That would be one. The second one would be we also support a request for grant funding from the Spark, what do they call the subcommittees? Advisory panels for equipment to replace fire equipment destroyed in wildfires that aren't covered under FEMA. My latest understanding is it's going to be $1.2 million, which is the high mark of what they used for the grant funding in earlier years for the small rural fire departments. And we may do as much as $500,000 for the $500,000 for 2 years on the wildfire equipment, or just one time?
Well, we were actually going to, on the second application, we were going to do $200,000 to $300,000 each year for the 3 years, just to sort of match the grant. And that would be for any damaged or destroyed equipment each year for the fire. And we'd be willing to roll that over from 1 year to the next, so that if we had a larger loss of equipment in the second or third year, we'd have the funds available. And then if we don't
I'm not sure we need to verify what the rules are on the Spark funding. I'm not sure if it's there in the third year that it can still be spent. Do you have thoughts on that, Dylan?
Mr. Chairman, I'd go back and double check, but this funding has a much longer time frame. I think it's closer to 5 years.
I thought today you said 3. Anyway.
I'll double check, but it
Okay,
is a longer time.
let's work those details out when we get with Shirley to make sure that we've got the language in there so that I can inform the Appropriations Committee what it is. But does anybody have any problem with putting this in there? Yes,
Thank you, Mr.
Representative
Chairman.
Poston.
Not a problem, just a question. Several members asked about insurance covering that equipment or not, if it's not covered by insurance.
True, if it's not covered by insurance or it's not covered by FEMA. Right. Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you know what, well, let's just say, large ticket items they're talking about that are be part of this process?
Yes, in December, the Ellis-Russell County fire, one of those departments actually had a truck burn, got caught in the fire. The firefighters were able to get out of the way, but the truck actually completely was destroyed. So we're talking if they lose hoses, if they have a truck damage. We've had some trucks, because of the heat and the fire, like their windshields are broken or cracked. So it would be there to help replace a windshield, to actually replace a whole truck. You know, a brush truck might run $80,000, $90,000, $100,000, and those volunteer departments don't have that money to replace a truck if they lose it.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Dylan's got just a little bit more information on that. Would you share it with the committee, please?
Certainly. Just as a review of the NCSL data would indicate that the spending has to be spent by December 31st, 2026. So that'd be FY 2027. It does have to be obligated by December 31st, 2024. So the decisions have to be made earlier, but the total expenditures can happen later.
It's the obligation that I'm getting confused about. Okay, good. All right. Other questions? Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, we basically have to agree on that we support the application through the Spark process. Okay. All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. 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 All opposed? Okay, motion carries. With that being said, there is a discussion of a recruitment and well, let's go ahead and take care of the 2022 budget first. I think that actually, with the exception of the Spark, I'm not sure that there's any action that needs to take place in the 2022, unless somebody else has something they want to bring up. Not? Okay. So is there a motion to approve with the exception of the Spark, or with the addition of the language for the Spark grant request, approve the governor's recommendation for 2022?
So moved.
Okay, is there a second? Motion was by Representative Poskin, second was by Representative Resman. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Motion carries. All right, so in the 2023 analysis, there is the $100,000 that the governor put back in her recommendation. What I would like to do on the $100,000 as a way to conserve SGF funds, I would, or the funds in his department for future issues, I would like to consider the $100,000 for the Kansas Firefighter Recruitment and Safety Grant Program at Omnibus, pending notification of where they are on the Sparks process. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, I'll make that motion. Is there a second? Second by Representative Resman. Is there any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Next item I have, I understand why things happen like they do sometimes in state government with salaries and enhancements like that, but it also frustrates me greatly when we have budget oversight and something happens outside of that process. So I would like to add a note to the 2023 request of the fact that the salary enhancement was increased by the executive branch in fiscal year 2022 without going through the legislative appropriations process. What's that? Well, it is. I mean, it's just the fact of the matter. They requested $410,000 for salary enhancements. The governor on January 9th issued an executive order, or an executive directive is the correct procedure, where they gave the 15% pay raises. Also, because the other employees were non-classified, they went through the Department of Administration process. So even though it's a 2023 enhancement, it's been enacted in 2022. So, and the reason that she's able to do that is because we haven't been the type of committee that have restricted their wage and salary line item to the amount that they actually spent the year before, you know, because normally they have vacancies. Normally they're trying to fill those vacancies. And because we didn't really tighten it down, it gave them an opportunity to do that. So with that being said, I would make a motion that we have a note on the report out that the 2023 salary enhancement was increased by the executive branch in fiscal year 2022 and did not go through the legislative appropriations process. Okay? Is there any discussion? All those in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no?
No.
Okay. I understand. All right. And do we have to, Shirley, do we have to take any special action on the capital improvement where they're replacing the trucks and the cars? I'm trying to see where that enhancement is.
Not unless you want to change something.
Okay. I don't particularly want to change anything. Does anybody? Okay. Is there any other action anybody would like to take on the fiscal year 2023 budget? Okay. Is there a motion to approve the governor's recommendation with the exceptions that we've already voted on? Is there a motion to approve it?
So moved.
Okay. Is there a second? Second is by Representative Resman. Motion was by Representative Poskin. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. Motion carries. All right. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Just real quick, I just want a couple of clarifications. On the note to consider the 100,000 recruit and safety grant at Omnibus, do you want to remove the money and consider it, or leave the money in and consider at Omnibus?
Remove it.
Remove the money.
And reconsider it.
And then on your salary enhancement note on the executive branch without legislative input, you mentioned 22, but you wanted the note in 23? Or do you want the note in 22?
It's my understanding they didn't make the request for 22. They made it for 23. And she, though, the governor went ahead and implemented it in 22. So we're kind of between a rock and a hard spot, right?
I just wanted to know if you wanted me to put it in both years or just in 23.
I think just in 23,
Okay.
because that's when it was originally in the budget to be. Okay. All right, with that out of the way, let's move on to the Kansas Department of Transportation budget hearing. I'll now open the hearing. In the first conferee before us today, we have Randy Stuckey with the Kansas Grain and Feed Association and the Kansas Cooperative Council. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Stuckey.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Randy Stuckey, and I serve as Senior Vice President, Government Affairs and General Counsel for the Kansas Grain and Feed Association. And you have some written testimony this morning, or this afternoon rather, from ourselves and then jointly with the Kansas Cooperative Council. And principally, what our ask is then is for a proviso on the Kansas Department of Transportation's budget for 23 and 24, fiscal years 23 and 24, to essentially extend a current program. It's the Short Line Rail Improvement Fund, which expires, it's current now. It was enacted in 2020 for 3 years, 2021 and 22. Expires in 22, so it's this year, 22, is to be the last year of funding for the program. Currently, it's funded at $5 million a year for 3 years, and 22 would be $5 million for this year. The program is used for both short line rail maintenance and improvement, and then also rail siding. Rail siding is where we come in. We're the shippers, the grain elevators and ag retail facilities that both receive chemical and fertilizer on the front end, and on the back end, we ship grain out to all corners of the world. And it's those short line rail that you either use the short line rail that's available or it's moves by truck, commercial trucks. And you have about 3 commercial trucks to each short line rail car. So if you do the quick math, each 100 car unit train takes 300 trucks off the road. And there are hundreds of unit trains that go out every year. So we're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of trucks, grain trucks, taken off state highways, drastically reducing wear and tear on state highways. So it's for that reason and others that in 2020, the legislature thought it was prudent to pass this rail improvement fund at $5 million a year. We're only asking this morning, after consultation with the chairman, for monies to go for the next 2 years to continue the funding for the rail siding projects, which generally are much smaller than if you're replacing the actual short line rail. It gets very expensive. For our projects, they can be as small as $30,000 for smaller projects to up to a couple $100,000 for a more involved project. Or if it's a new build out, we've had projects let for about $1 million. So the majority of the projects have been about $250,000 a year per project. And we would just ask for a proviso for $2 million a year for 2 years to continue the program for rail siding. And we'd ask that you take that under consideration.
I need to ask a question. We can only do it for fiscal year 2023, can't we? We can't do it for 2 years, isn't that right?
Mr. Chairman, it's discouraged to go out beyond just those two, the current year and budget year, because then we'd have to reappropriate those funds for that purpose.
If this was a double-year budget, it would be somewhat different, but we're not in that cycle either. So I'm sorry if there was any miscommunication on that. We can only do it for 2023 because of the way we're doing this. I've had some conversations with others in your industry. I understand that there's $2 million for the short line rails. Have you ever came up with any numbers or any idea of the need that would also help with siding improvements on the main lines?
So it's a good question. And in 2020, when the initial conversations were had on why the investment in short line rail, the rail lines themselves need to be improved and replaced, rather, because they need the thicker line, the rail line, for the heavier cars. And most of those cars on Class 1 line are already being used, so they build those out now for Class 1 at that heavier rail. And so I would think that most of the siding projects would have already been updated as well. I can't say that's everyone, but because they've used that heavier rail for a long time now on Class 1, a lot of those projects may have already been done.
So let me say this back to you again so that I make sure I understand. A lot of the short lines were built with a lighter rail. They're upgrading to a higher rail or a heavier rail because of what rail cars are like now, and that's not the case on the main lines. They were already built to that standard.
Or have been replaced to that standard.
Okay.
Now, we certainly wouldn't say no. We've got members on Class 1 and Class 2, and they would, I'm sure, like to take advantage of the program as well. But just want to give for full disclosure, that's why the short line grant program was created in 2020.
Okay, so it's $2 million, and this program has a required match of what percent?
So it's a 70-30 grant program, cost share. So it's not just the grant, it's cost share, meaning the facility puts in 30% and 70% was the state.
And one of the reasons I wanted to have Mr. Stuckey come first is, so if the administration has any concerns about this project, they would have a lot of opportunity to mention. And if we want to follow up with any questions with the administration when they make their presentation, we have the opportunity to do so. So thank you very much, Mr. Stuckey. Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Wiggle, go ahead.
Thank you. In your experience, when you're talking about improvements to the short line, which what we're talking about is that they're coming in to the grain facilities, loading up and then going out, correct?
Correct.
In your experience over past years, what kind of money do they usually spend on those kind of projects?
Sure. So as I mentioned in early on, the grants that have been let, so it's the Department of Transportation receives all these applications, and then with the money available, makes a decision about where the money would best be spent. And so the grants that have been, the cost share grants that have been authorized or let, we've seen one project that was $1 million or just under $1 million for the rail siding. That was a very large build out. The others come in at around $200,000 or $100,000 or below, and even as small as $30,000 for just, I think, replacement of some of the ballasts and other equipment.
So you're looking at anywhere at a range from, say, 200,000 up to $1 million for roughly the same type of siding, correct?
Well, the projects would all be different, so I wouldn't say they'd be the same type of siding, but
Well,
so
what I mean
longer
is,
or,
in that type of an atmosphere that you're looking at, it's that they're, some are going to be a little bit more, some are going to be a little bit less.
that's correct, right?
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Representative Resman.
Chairman, you mentioned that they're currently using a smaller rail or a lighter rail, and you're transferring that over or replacing that with a heavier rail. What's the percentage of the heavier rail that's been placed in service now? Do you have any idea?
I don't have a percentage, but I know that it's certainly something that's being pushed in both Oklahoma and Kansas. And for those that, what we've been told is for those that have not been updated or are not going to be updated in the future, you're going to have, we suffer from inconsistency with service, and we're just going to have more lines taken out of service because they can't connect then to the Class 1. So it's imperative that we continue to invest in the rail line.
Representative Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the companies do not invest any money at all that runs the train lines?
So under this program, the 70-30 cost share program, they would be investing the 30% as well for their rail line projects, just as the rail siding companies would, the grain elevators invest that 30% for the 70% cost share.
And the government, federal government does the 70?
No, it's out of the state highway fund.
Okay. So it's, the businesses get 30% and we do the 70%.
So the businesses pitch in the 30%, and the state highway fund would spend the 70.
Thank you.
I'm sorry about that, Madam Secretary. I forgot about your hard stop. And we'll continue this conversation later. Would you like to go ahead and go next, Madam Secretary, so you can make your next appointment?
Oh, thank you. That would be great. I think Joel, pull my slides up for me, please. Now, for some of you who are on House Transportation or Appropriations, you may have heard some of this before, but I'll try to make sure that I focus primarily on the budget pieces. And we do have some information on performance-based budgeting at the end, which is related to the subsurface performance measures. And so if we aren't able to get to quite all of it today, I'm always happy to come back around some of those pieces if we don't get to them today. Okay, so Joel, let's go on to the next slide, please. So I have 5 areas to cover today, both expenditures and revenues, as well as, you know, KDOT is funded in a slightly different way than most agencies, both because of the State Highway Fund, next slide, but also because the work that we do has a really long, excuse me, lifespan. You've probably seen this slide before. We have a variety of revenue sources. All of those are protected by the Constitution with the exception of sales tax. Most of those funds go to the State Highway Fund. We then share some of those with the special city through the Special City County Highway Fund. And there are some ordinary transfers that we'll talk about in just a minute that go to other agencies. Next slide. We have a fairly well-balanced revenue stream at this point. About 37% comes from sales tax, about 26% from motor fuels, and about 23% from federal funds. Currently, that's a solid source of funding over the long term, and we had some conversation around this in utilities. Long term, we know that motor fuels tax, and Joel, I know, met with you all about RUC. Long term, we have concerns about the stability of motor fuels taxes. And think of it more like a light switch than an on and off switch. We project those to be solid for the next few years, but it's something we're keeping an eye on. Next slide, please. Our expenditures, as you would want to see, construction is by far our largest expenditure. I wanted to let you know that we plan in September to pay up part of our bond indebtedness, $97.8 million, which will net save us $20 million in interest over, I think we're paying this off maybe about 10 years early. So we'll be saving some money from interest payments. Next slide. Okay, so this is the part that is unlike most agencies. We have a budget. I don't like the language, but we have a limited side and the unlimited side. The limited side, which is what we're talking about today, is related to agency operations, and it is a total fixed cap. Within that, we have salaries and wages, contractual services, commodities, and capital outlays. We have some limited ability to shift funds from category based on needs throughout the year, and those changes are then included in today's revised budget. On the unlimited side, that's where you see money for construction and project-related expenses. It doesn't mean there's no limit to the money. It just means that it doesn't fall within the budget that we bring forward to you all. Okay, next slide. You'll see today that we are requesting a modest increase to our agency operations budget up to $306 million for FY23. If you look back in time, so if you take sort of this 10-year view, what you'll see is that in FY 2012, we were at $290 million for agency ops. When adjusted for inflation, that was actually that would be $385 million in today's dollars. We need an increase, not a big increase, but we do need a slight increase in our agency operations because of the increased amount of work that we have through the passage of the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program, and I'll outline where those increases would occur. Next slide. I'll also tell you we have been managing our budget much more tightly. So in previous years, you'll see that there was a legislatively approved amount, that's the blue bar, and then how much we spent is the yellow bar, which was always lagged that. And it's, you know, there's no reason to go ask for more money if you're not spending what you already have well. What we actually saw is there were salary savings. We delayed equipment purchases through some of those years, FY 16, 17, 18. Quite frankly, just as we are sort of working to strengthen our infrastructure, we are also working to strengthen the equipment with which we use to do snow plowing and, dump trucks and all those other sorts of the equipment that we need. We've had to update and modernize that. Next slide. So as I've said, generally, you can see here the increase in our total expenditures, primarily driven by that unlimited side, but we've had remained relatively flat in terms of our operations costs, which are in the gold bar. Okay, next slide. So this is where you'll see the request for the $22 million increase from FY22 to FY23. You'll see an increase of 2.8 million for salaries and wages. So we met last time, and thank you, Representative Francis, for really, I think, holding some really fantastic hearings related to salaries and wages and workforce issues. We want to see an increase in this line item because we know we're worried about hiring inspectors and our engineering techs, so we request a small increase there. On the contractual services, we request an increase of 9.7 million. And those are places that are more related to the increased amount of work. Remember, construction lettings have increased by 200%. On the others, commodity capital outlay and other assistance, these are restoring to funding levels, like I talked about, modernizing some of our fleet and keeping up with some cost increases. If you see the little icons there to the left, like the little like worker and the piece of equipment, that will track. I'll provide more detail on each of these issues. So let's start first with the salary and wage request. As you know, we've talked about this. We have fewer employees. We did take some actions, next slide, to increase equipment operator pay, both the equipment operators and the engineers in 2019, and then most recently equipment operators again, based on the data that we had related to turnover rates, what it costs to train folks, and our workforce incidents. We focused on raising the starting wages, and we used KTA as our benchmark, our salary comparison, to bring those salaries up. It was funded through salary savings at the time, but over time we know the amount of savings. The idea is we want to be hiring people. That's why we increased their salary. So we should have less salary savings over time because we're hiring more people. The impact for this particular action in 21 was 638 folks. Next slide. So we are requesting specifically an increase to 598 million for salaries. It also will add a few positions in traffic safety, maintenance, engineering, HR, and construction inspectors. So that's where we would apply the additional salary dollars. Next slide. As we've talked about, any of the actions that can be taken, whether it's approving the 5% increase for state employees, increased contributions to CAPERS, lower healthcare costs, we appreciate anything you all can do. So we would appreciate any of it. Okay, moving on to the next bucket, if you will, of increase. This would be on the contractual services side. You'll recall that $5 billion happens on preservation, about $2.3 billion in modernization and expansion. And you can see the other investments listed there. We're ramping up quickly to address rebuilding our infrastructure and making necessary improvements. Next slide. This is where we show where we've seen the increase as required by IKE and fully supported by the department. There's been an increase in preservation investment, as there should be. And you can also see an increase in modernization and expansion to a total lettings of $980 million in FY22. Quick note, this does include the requirement under IKE that one phase of all T-Works projects have been let. And I'm glad to tell you that that is, in fact, what's happened. When you look forward to 23, these are the ranges of investment that we would anticipate in each of those buckets, both depending on inflation, as well as, pushing work out the door, making sure we're still getting competitive bids. Next slide. As it relates to contractual services, you see here that it has not increased much, but it does track a little bit with increased lettings. What we see here, contractual services can be things like engineering. Okay, next slide. Which lays this out a little more clearly. We've seen a $9 million increase. We would like to spend from FY15 to, and 5 years later, spend $9 million more on contractual services, recognizing that in that same time period of 5 years, we have 281 fewer employees, which is a roughly $6 million in salary savings. So we are outsourcing more work because we simply have to. But I wanted you to understand, it's not a phenomenal difference. It is more expensive, but it's not a huge amount more. Next slide. For those of you from particularly District 1, we know that trash and other sorts of services have to be provided, whether we have the forces or not. That's another place in contractual services. For the first time, I think it was 2 years ago, we led a contract for trash collection. Typically, KDOT forces pick up trash. We just don't have enough folks to do it, but you still have to get the work done. So we have outsourced that to some degree. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the new features of the 23 budget. This first slide's excellent. As proposed by the governor, and I very much appreciate the legislature's support following the legislative task force that met in 2018, and then we worked for 2 years to pass the IKE program. You can see those extraordinary transfers, the gold bars, have continued to decline. That is the assurance that contractors need to come back to the state. This is really the fuel of IKE, because now we're properly funding our transportation program. We have fantastic work going on around the state, and I thank every one of you for your support. Next slide. We are requesting District 1, so that's here in Topeka, a capital improvement project to replace the building that was built in the 1930s. It's antiquated. We can't house proper testing equipment there. We would move it to existing, we would rebuild on, or we would build new on existing KDOT property. We did a feasibility study back in 2007. It was decided, at that time we couldn't afford as a state to build it. We have been waiting. Next slide. What I would tell you is that we would like to phase the work in 2 pieces, and it would cost $18.5 million, which is a lot of money, and I understand that. I'm hopeful that we can find a way to do it, because the work, when it was estimated back in 2007, it was 2007, it was $14 million. So it's just that inflation piece that's worrisome if we're not able to build it. Okay, next slide. For those of you who love performance-based budgeting, you've heard me say a couple times now that preservation is our largest investment. Our state highway system is worth north of $30 billion. We know we need to take care of it. We have anticipated investing $385 million per year, $5 billion in total over the life of IKE. What we know is that all pavement projects aren't the same. A thin overlay is 1x, rehab is 2x, reconstruction is 3x for asphalt and 4x for concrete. And as you would expect, you get different life out of those actions depending on how heavy they are. Next slide. We have about 10,000 miles of highway. You can think of it this way. Every year you take out 1 year's life off of the entire system. So to stay even, we need to add 10,000 miles of 1 year back each year. I didn't make up that metric, but that's how we've been talking about it up until today. Next slide. So in terms of math, I'm glad to say last year, by the mix of actions we took, we essentially replaced 1 year last year as we should, which would mean we're in steady state, except we're really sort of trying to dig out of the ditch. Next slide. Because in previous years, when you saw those lettings were so low, we weren't doing robust or heavy actions. So for example, in 2017, you can see we only did 122 miles of those heavy actions, resulting in only sort of investing 6,000 miles, 1 year of 6,000 miles. Next slide. Or in a graphic sense, we lost life in our system. We are starting to bend that curve a bit now that we are under the IKE program. Next slide. This is one of Senator Dietrich's favorite measures on the left, because essentially before now, we could tell you, KDOT could say, yeah, we're better than we were last year. We're not quite as good as last year. So in a sense, a report card, but you never really knew, am I going from a C to a B? Or from a C to a D, or were we starting at E, at F? So now we have a better measure I'm going to tell you about in just a minute because it is a big deal. We have federal measures, however, they only measure the surface. And so from just a surface standpoint, because remember we were doing a lot of surface actions, our pavement appears to be in pretty good shape. However, for those of you who are on the task force, you'll recall, next slide, Joel. When we were in Olathe, we talked about, this is a slide, this is a picture of 83, US 83. And if you're a highway kind of person, you would say that is a gorgeous highway. It's flat, it's got good dark pavement, it's got bright stripes, it's got some shoulders, rumble strips, it's excellent. However, from that very same road, if you core underneath, it's crumbling. And that's why what you see is not always what you get. Next slide. Now, I'm glad to say we have a new subsurface rating system that can tell us what's going on underneath the core. That's good news. Now we know we can compare, we can relate to you what's going on with the system. However, there's a bit of bad news as well. Next slide. In that at our current investment level, we'll level off in 22, and then we'll start to reduce the poor condition of our highways. However, next slide, and I'm trying to make sure I get through this. When you project over time, what you see is the number of miles we have in poor condition declines just a little bit. The pavement we have in fair condition, we have more pavement that's in fair condition, but our good condition goes from 32% down to 24%. When KDOT staff brought that to me, I was like, well, like in some ways, I don't know what to make of that. Is that good news? Is that bad news? Well, the answer is we need to do more work. Now we can measure what's going on in our highway system under the surface. The next step we need to take, go on, Joel, please, is to bring to you a more robust approach to managing our system, performance-based budgeting, which is to say, what condition level do we want to have our interstates, our non-interstates, our rural highways? What's like the proper mix? Until this point, KDOT, if you gave us $10, we'd make the best use of that $10 available. Now, with this committee and others, we'll be able to say, if you want performance at X, it'll be 200 million. If you want performance at Y, it would be 600 million. We can have a much better informed conversation about what performance you want to see and what the state can afford. It's really a much better way to manage our system. You may remember when I was here in 2019, I said, oh, these performance measures, we need to modernize the way we do our work at KDOT. And I'm pleased to say this is a huge, huge step forward. And it's also not magic. Lots of states around the country use these very same measures. Utah, Colorado, Nevada, North Carolina, we're using tried and true methodology. And I'm really quite pleased with the progress we've made. Would love to come back and talk to you more about that at some time. Okay, next slide. Under the IKE program, as you saw, that investment level holds us steady. Bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law could help us improve. Next slide, Joel. So it really, because we have the right framework and now we have IKE funds and some additional federal funds. Let's talk about what those look like, Joel. Next slide. Highways, we will have $89 million additional per year. Now remember, that's going to go on the unlimited side. That is helpful, no doubt. It is not like this amazing windfall. It is a helpful amount. $89 million also goes really quickly. New dollars in bridges, so important because we know on our local system, bridges need a lot of help. $8 million per year for vehicle charging, and it could also be for electrification of fleets. 3.7 million for rural transit. I have some concerns there because we're having a hard time finding bus drivers, for a total of 145 million more per year. There are also lots of discretionary grant programs that we'll be working with communities to assist them in a regional way to go to seek additional dollars. Next slide. absolutely, as we do in every component of IKE, we will seek to work with our partners at cities and counties with these goals, next slide, Joel, to save lives, to reduce transportation costs, and strengthen our communities by innovating our infrastructure. And, I would be happy to stand for questions for like 10 or 15 minutes. I'm not trying to give you short shrift. Always happy to come back to, so I can stay till like 4:35, 4:40 maybe.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And again, I apologize. I was told about that hard stop, and then I had a moment and forgot about it. So questions for the Secretary. Boy, you were really fast on that one, Madam Secretary. Questions? Representative Esau.
I apologize that my question isn't related to the budget, and so if you would like to defer answering at another time, that is fine. If we should end up with a facility that adds, say, 5,000 cars to K-10, are we ready to do the improvements to it in the time period that might be needed? That's just
So here's
some
what I do.
conversation we've had.
Well, so here's what, like, the good news is because of the new rolling program with the development pipeline and the construction pipeline, we put K-10 into the development pipeline in December. So that's using our, an important process. We have not identified the western boundary of that study area. So I think that's very helpful. And so we could move pronto to the study and the environmental clearance. And then also remember this again, thanks for passing IKE. We have $500 million cap for alternative delivery, which means, you can do the design in the building, not at the same time, but in much tighter sequence. So, I don't want to get over my skis, but we are in much better shape than we might otherwise be in. We'd be in, pretty good shape.
Thank you. That answered my question, and the rest of the budget was very, very helpful. Thank you.
I feel good about the K-10 process. What I'd say.
Go ahead, Madam Secretary.
I would just say, I feel good about where we are with K-10. It doesn't mean that we don't have to pay close attention to schedules.
But also talking about K-10 the other day when we were, I was in another committee and we talked about this. What's the projected cost estimate for K-10? Do you have any very rough preliminary number?
Well, I know Calvin is sitting on the front row, so if he nods, great. If he has a different number, I think it's like 225.
And just to put that in perspective, we're getting an additional $85 million from the feds. We've got the US 69 project that's multi-million dollars. You can see how quickly that $85 million gets gobbled up. It seems like a lot of money, but it goes, I don't know what what do they call it? The viaduct? What do they call the I-70?
Oh, Paul Quincy.
Yeah, what's the ballpark estimate for that one?
200.
Yeah, so, $85 million can help us a lot each year on each of those, but it goes quickly. Before we fall too much into just talking about my passing lanes and the things I want in western Kansas, I do want to ask, I know you've got a lot of familiarity with the Spark process, maybe not so much with the current iteration. Do you have any projects that we could make, that you could apply for, that we could help by adding this to our budget recommendation to give it additional support?
So the one that you suggested, I think, was it in-house transportation maybe? So
I think you suggested it, but I always like your good ideas. You're a lot smarter than I am.
So I think the one place, so as I've talked about this pavement the new performance measure on the subsurface pavement, we do need to buy a new pavement management system. It's a computer system that connects all the data together and helps prioritize segments. And when I talk about segments, they're like about 1/10 of a mile segment. You do that over 10,000 miles, it's tons of data. It's about $2 million. We have it in our budget. If Spark could pay for it, great, but we can't, I know that like that's a multi-layered process. And so we need to move forward. If it could be if it can be afforded by Spark, that'd be great. But like, we can't not order it, if you will, like, because we've got a lot of I don't know, like there's just a lot of process to move the data over and whatnot. So I think that's probably the place we would see first. I know Amy Link has taken a look to see if there are other options for us, but that's probably the thing that comes to mind first.
Yeah, if you could make an application for that and then get us the wording for us to add on our budget proposal, I don't think we would preclude you being able to do it in any way. But I think they're getting ready to move that process forward pretty quickly. So I wouldn't even attempt to take it out of your budget. I mean, you guys have designated funds. Can you talk just a little bit more real quickly about the need for the new District 1 headquarters? What kind of is precipitating that other than the fact that it's older than my grandmother?
Well, I think we've had any number of like leaking roofs, and the truck bays aren't large enough, and we don't have enough room for the equipment. The testing equipment has changed dramatically over that time period. It's just an inadequate facility. We would want to have proper offices. I'm not saying it's moldy, but it is not in disrepair, but it is not in good shape either.
And then I want to thank you very much for the salary information that you gave us on some of the hard-to-fill positions in your department. Is this something you're going to be taking action on, or is there something that we can do to help you address these issues? Where we've got, you show that the engineering tech hourly rate is $16.56, and the AASHTO survey in 2020 said that $18.30 was market rate. Average consultant hourly rate is $21.54. Where are we at on that? What do we need to do?
Well, I think there are a couple. I would leave it to this committee to debate how this works. I think it's maybe both. It may be, the governor has proposed 5%, which I think would be really helpful for the entire workforce. I'm not sure that gets us where we need to be on a couple of these really hard to fill positions, and particularly as it relates to the inspectors are the place that we now have our biggest concern, which is filled by the engineering techs. So that would be one place where I would identify some concerns. And we've also had conversation, there is a compression issue at play. So while we did bring the starting salary up because we were having such a hard time hiring equipment operators because we were not competitive with cities or counties, that does create a compression problem for those equipment operators that have been at KDOT for a long time. So there are a couple of, real concerning points. I do think the 5% is important for everyone, but I think we do have a couple of places where we have some additional concerns.
Okay, other questions? And we can get, she's got just a few minutes left. You guys can talk about your projects. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for taking time
Thank you
to
so
visit
much.
with
Thanks
us
for letting
today.
me remote in. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right. All right. At this time, I think we're going to have the budget overview by Dylan Deere. Welcome to the committee, Dylan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Dylan Deere. I'm with the Legislative Research Department, and this will be my first year doing the KDOT budget, and hopefully my last. After the presentation by the Secretary, this is going to be a lot more dry and numbers-based, but please do bear with me, and I do have representatives from the agency behind me as well for any additional follow-up questions. Looking at that, if you would like to turn to page 5, I'll talk about the FY 2022 budget for the Department of Transportation. The pages before this are just sort of overview. You've already seen these. They're all structured more or less the same. So the 2021 legislature approved a budget for the Department of Transportation of $2.2 billion. And then I'm going to go through all the various adjustments that were made to that amount in the agency request. There is no state general fund inside the Department of Transportation, so it's all federal, special revenue funds, federal funds, state highway funds, stuff like that. So first, there's the addition of $4.3 million for 47 additional FTE positions, and that's 25 FTE in administration, 31 in construction, 5 in local support, 10 in transportation planning, and there's a 24 FTE reduction in the maintenance program. I've been told that the increases in the administration program are in operation support in the district offices and HR. So these aren't all Topeka offices. They're spread across Kansas. Turn to the next page. Number 3, you have a decrease of $13.9 million. The majority of that is in the construction program of $24 million. And the decrease is partially offset by increases in administration and maintenance for contract engineering, and the administration program increase is due to the road use study, which I believe you've already been briefed on. There is the $1.3 million increase for the Kansas City metropolitan area in District 1 for the trash pickup. I believe that was mentioned. There is an increase of $920,000 for storing and analyzing data on bridges, traffic management, and communications. There's a decrease of $1.2 million in commodities for construction materials and diesel fuel, and that's just, like I said, that's asphalt and tar, stuff like that. Construction equipment, you have a decrease of $973,001, so almost $1 million. I believe the Secretary had mentioned that there was some increased purchases in 21 because there was a little bit of headroom inside the budget, allowed them to bring down the equipment purchases in FY 2022. There's $14.2 million in federal grants, mostly in the CARES fund. There's in the Rail Safety Improvement Fund, you have the addition of $3 million for a total of $9 million. And for the short line rail, there's the addition of $4.5 million for short line rail improvements. And it's been indicated to me that that's a carryover from the previous fiscal year. For the coordinated public transportation, there's $7.2 million for coordinated public transportation. That's also carryover. For transportation tech development, there's an addition of $3 million for this new transportation technology development fund. This is specifically for new investments in new technologies and increases in efficiency in aviation and highway transportation. For construction capital improvements, you have decreases by $256.8 million in capital improvements expansion projects. It's $283.4 is in non-interstate capacity improvements, $8.5 million in cost share, and there's an increase of $25.6 million in interstate expansion projects. The primary reason for these adjustments are delays in the US 69 highway project implementation. And turning to page 7, you have construction local capital improvement. There's a addition of $54.5 million in capital improvements local projects, and that increase is primarily from increases to federal aid, FHA aid, and also some transportation enhancements. For construction modernization CI, you have an addition of $39.3 million in capital improvements modernization projects. The majority of the increase is in non-interstate. That's about 21.3, but there are also some substantial increases in lighting and corridor management as well. For construction preservation capital improvements, this is decreases by $4.5 million in capital improvement preservation projects, and the majority of the reduction is in bridge replacement. 30.1 million of that is in bridge replacement, and there's a substantial shift of funding to basic preservation in this program. And for buildings capital improvements, we have the addition of $6 million in capital improvements projects, and I'll talk about that when I talk about capital improvements at the end of the presentation. The governor mostly concurred with the agency request. She did add $10.4 million in state highway fund dollars, and that's just due to a revised consensus state highway fund revenue estimate. So just sort of integrating that revised estimate into the budget. With that, I would stand for questions for fiscal year 2022 before moving to fiscal year 23.
Questions? Big budget. Big budget. Hey, I have one on page 5 where we talk about the FTE increases. Says the agency requests the addition of 4.3 million and 47 FTE positions, but then they add up to more than 47. We've got 25 in administration and 31 in construction. And
25 and 31 and 5 and 10, and then a decrease of 24. And I think that adds up to 47, and if it doesn't, I've messed up my math
Okay,
somewhere.
gotcha. All right, thank you.
All right.
You got to be able to subtract, huh? Doesn't happen often in government, does it? All right.
If there's no questions on 22, I will move to the 23 budget. That starts on page 9. So carrying forward the agency revised estimate from 22, you're going to see some negative numbers up here. What that is that when you add money in 22, okay, if it doesn't carry forward into 23, you got to reverse it out to get back to the number. So you start with those federal grants, that $14.2 million in federal grants I mentioned. So those obviously are not present in 23 yet, although you may end up getting carryover spending. You certainly will. There is a reduction of the $4.5 million for the short line rail and a reduction of $3.3 million for the rail safety improvements. And that's just, like I said, reversing those monies back out. For the maintenance program commodities, the agency is requesting an increase in commodities of $3.5 million above the 2022 revised estimate. And that's mostly in construction materials, $2.3 million. And there's also some increases for vehicle parts and fuel in that year as well. There's addition of $3.7 million in the maintenance program for road and other highway construction equipment. And once again, you had that decrease in 22 and see it popping back up in 23. For the maintenance program salaries, you have the addition of $2.9 million in salaries, and the majority of the increase is in unclassified comp, straight comp. That's $2.1 million of that. And that increase is primarily attributable to the Executive Directive 20-539, which was implemented. That totals $2.8 million. There's a reduction of $10.8 million in the cost share program. Just to remind you, that's that 15% non-state cash match program requirement. And that reduction is largely because they just budget it when they get commitments. And so we'll probably see a bump up in that as it gets closer to FY23. For construction reallocation, you have a reduction of $19.4 million in the construction program capital improvements. There's some reallocation going on, and I think as we get closer to 23, you'll see these numbers change further. For transportation tech development, that's deleting $3.0 million budgeted in 22 for research investments in transportation technology. Again, that's just reversing out those monies that were put in. And the addition of $4.3 million for aid to local units in non-tech, and that's $2 million in coordinated public transportation assistance and $1.1 million in general aviation. And they're going to add $2.0 million for capital improvements, and I'll talk about that at the end. Looking at the governor's recommendation, from an expenditure perspective, the only adjustment was, putting in those consensus revenue estimates for the State Highway Fund. But from a transfers perspective, the recommendation also eliminates the transfers from the State Highway Fund for KDADs, for mental health grants. Those were $9.8 million. The Office of Emergency Communications and the Adjutant General, that's $320,000. And debt service for the State House bonds, which was in the Department Administration budget, which is $20.4 million. And also eliminates the transfer to the State General Fund. So there was also State Highway Fund transfer to State General Fund. That's also eliminated in 23. Those are partially offset. There's slight increases in the transfer for like KHP, but it's small. It doesn't really offset it. It's just a slight increase right there. With that, I would stand for questions on the FY23 budget.
Questions, committee? Okay, don't see any. Go ahead.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and walk through a couple of pages real quick. I just want to point out some numbers. If you turn to page 12, I want to talk a little bit about performance measures for a little bit. If you look at the percent on page 12, the first measure is the percent of bridges by deck area on the state highway system in good condition. Well, you're going from 71% in 20 to 70.7 to a target of 67%. So that is a declining number. I think the Secretary did make a reference to that in her presentation, so that's being reflected here as well. And if you look at the percent of non-interstate state highway miles classified as good for pavement, you're going from 62 to 58. So once again, you're seeing those same patterns. If you turn to the next page, on page 13, and you look at the percent and number 5 for administration, the percent of total cost for highway construction projects completed over or under budget, you are seeing a pattern, and there's a 3-year average of them coming in about 1.4% above average. We don't have any projections for 22 or 23 to come out over budget. However, with the state of inflation, I would expect to see that number coming in pretty high. Moving to page 14. There has been some discussion of this in appropriations. I don't know if the Secretary touched on it, but if you look at serious injuries per 100 million miles and fatalities per 100 million miles, you're looking at some pretty high numbers on the state highway system. There is some indication that they're looking to hire into some positions that are some safety studies and stuff like that. The other measures throughout the rest of the sections, they're all pretty flat, except, oh, I did want to point out a little bit on local support. No, on transportation planning and modal support on page 14. Oh, yeah, I already touched, I touched on this a little bit on safety, but I also wanted to mention on measure 8 for annual ridership for urban public transit operators. You saw that, for actual 2021, that goes from 6 million to 3.4 million. So there's a huge reduction in that. They are anticipating that's going to pop back up. Their target is 4 million in 22. That's still well below the 3-year average of 5.6 million. So it's just something I want to point out. All right, moving to capital improvements. And that starts on page 23. So the agency is requesting 21 million in capital improvements for buildings. This is just buildings. So the entire KDOT budget, more or less, is capital improvements. However, this is the portion of it that deals with the buildings that they maintain. And the agency is requesting 21 million in capital improvements for buildings. This is an increase of 6 million above the 2022 approved budget. The majority of that increase is in sub-area modernization. And I'll talk about that in a moment. They are requesting $4.6 million for rehabilitation and repair. Turn to the next page. There is a request of 1.5 million for re-roofing. The majority of that re-roofing is at the various salt domes or cones. And you can see those in Wamego, Holton, Abilene, Yates Center. So there's a list of them there where those re-roofing projects are going to occur. There's sub-area modernization at 9.5 million. And the agency indicates that they were constructed in the 50s and early 60s and that they need to be updated. And those modernizations are going to be for Hill City, Oberlin, Osborne, and Scott City in 2022. And these you're going to see every year. They just keep rolling out these modernizations. There's some land purchases in Garnett and Independence. There's $245,000 for a chemical storage facility, and there is 1.6 million for update of an electrical bay and extension district shop in Wichita. There's also a $3.5 million to relocate an area in Concordia, and they want to move the current office from Mankato to Concordia to support area office operations. I'm going to go, if it's okay with everybody, I'm just going to go ahead and move on through 23. There's an increase of 2 million above the 2022 revised estimate. The majority of the increase is for that District 1 headquarters that was mentioned earlier. So there's 4.2 million for rehab and repair. There's re-roofing at Troy, Manhattan, Norton. That's the list right there. There's sub-area modernization locations at Abilene, Beloit, Iola, and Medicine Lodge. There's some land purchases at Erie and Lyons. Another chemical storage facility, once again, in Pratt. There's updated electrical bay in Ulysses, and I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the construction of the District 1 headquarters. The agency is requesting $11 million, okay, but that's not all in this budget. So a portion of it's here, and $7.5 million will be budgeted for fiscal year 2024. So the project would relocate and consolidate to a single site the following facilities: the District 1 headquarters office, the maintenance shop, the materials lab, and the supply and stock room. All right. And the agency indicates that the District 1 materials lab was constructed in 1936, and the current District 1 office and shop was constructed in 1934. There were some modernizations that occurred in 58, 61, and 85. The proposed administration office would have 14,000 square feet and have like conference meeting rooms, break rooms, test restrooms, file storage. The supply stock room and the district materials lab would come to about 7,500 square feet. And the district materials lab would come to about 6,800 square feet. And this would all be at 21st and Rice Road. I think that was mentioned already. So it's out near 70, near Lonnie Q's barbecue, actually. I just noticed that. So with that, I would stand for questions on the capital improvements budget.
Questions? Go ahead, Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This new facility that's going to be built at I-70 and 21st Street and Rice Road, is all of the land there owned by KDOT or the state?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I don't know what the current status is, and I have to defer to the agency on that question.
Is anybody with the agency here? Do you know? We'd love for you to, or you can get an answer to the committee if that would be better. Okay.
And just another part on that, I just read it here. What is a nuclear meter facility or something? I can't find it now, but that kind of struck out at me. What's a nuclear meter, whatever it is? And it's on this last page.
Nuclear meter storage area.
Storage area, yeah.
Yeah.
What is that for?
If you want to come to the mic and introduce yourself, I would imagine Secretary Lorenz is glad that she's not here for some of these questions.
Anytime I see nuclear,
So Calvin Reed, Director for Engineering and Design. A nuclear meter is to measure the density of the subgrade when we go out and do major construction projects to make sure that it's up to our standard. And it's a common device that is used for this type of industry, but it does require certain special requirements for storage and safekeeping.
well, that's going to be the second part of the question is this something that's like hazardous or people shouldn't be around other than the people that are operating it?
There are special requirements for the people that operate it, yes. And it is stored in a way to keep it safe. This is a device that's been used in the transportation industry and other industries for at least the last 40 to 50 years. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Wagle, where are you seeing that? Just so that I,
It's on the
Last paragraph?
Last paragraph, or second to last paragraph, actually, about 2/3 of the way down.
is that part of the, is that similar to the equipment that she was talking about for the 2 million for the SCORE grant program? Okay, it has no relationship to that. They both deal with subgrade though somewhat. Is that right? The mapping system that she mentioned or whatever?
Yeah, the pavement management system that she mentioned is more like an analytical system to determine kind of the future pavement conditions based off of what we measure in the field. This is actually used during construction to make sure we're meeting the right quality standards.
Okay, all right. Other questions for either Dylan or members of the KDOT staff? Okay, so we're going to work this budget. I believe it's scheduled for February 16th, kind of a gap here, but we're trying to stay caught up. Monday, we're going to have hearings on the Adjutant General and the Sentencing Commission. You have those print-offs in your folder here, so you should be able to take them home if you want to review them prior to the meeting Monday.
Put them in there yet, but I can do that tomorrow when I come. But I emailed them to them. They all have them emailed.
None of you guys have them? Yeah, I think they do have them. Yeah, I think you put them in there. Some things we don't. Yeah, everybody's got it. Yeah. If you do take it home, just try to remember to bring it back. I know that's always one of the problems I have. I take it home and then I forget to bring it back and whatever else. Okay. If there's nothing else for the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.